Folks tend to think the NFL is all glitter and glory, but that dog don't hunt. Sometimes, the good Lord throws a curveball that hits a man harder than any linebacker ever could. We're talking about warriors like Marquise Goodwin, who strapped on a helmet mere hours after losing his baby boy, and Torrey Smith, hauling in catches while mourning a brother lost to the asphalt. Young Tevin met the Lord way too soon in a motorcycle wreck up in northeastern Virginia. These aren't just stats in a book. These are the stories that left the whole stadium reaching for a handkerchief. First up, let's talk about Marquise Goodwin. Now, that boy could run like a scalded dog, fastest thing on cleats, but the heaviest burden he ever carried had nothing to do with a 40-yard dash. It was November 12th, 2017, a day that left grown men weeping openly on the sidelines. You see, Goodwin wasn't just some run-of-the-mill wideout. He was a track star of the highest caliber, pure and simple. Before he turned pro, he was a Longhorn legend, winning 2 national titles in the long jump right here in Texas and wearing the red, white, and blue in the Olympics. The gridiron was just one chapter of his book. But come that Sunday in 2017, that field became the setting for the gutsiest performance of his life. Before the sun was fully up, his sweet wife Morgan went into labor way too early, only 19 weeks, along with little Marquise Jr. The poor little tyke was born silent. His lungs just weren't ready for this world. This heartbreak hit just a few hours before the Niners were set to square off against the Giants. Now, nobody would have blamed him if he'd stayed home and shut the door. His brothers in the locker room didn't expect to see him suit up. Goodwin had let him know things were rocky at home, and the team told him they'd back him to the hilt, no matter what path he took. But after they shared a prayer, Morgan looked at him and told him to go do his job. So he showed up at the stadium, running on fumes and grief, and told Coach Shanahan he was ready to roll. Come the second quarter, the Niners' offense was moving slower than molasses in January. Facing a long third down, Shanahan decided to take a shot and dialed up a deep ball for Goodwin. Truth is, that play nearly fell apart before it started. The blocking was shaky as a leaf in a storm, and Shanahan thought it was a bust, but C.J. Beathard hung in the pocket and heaved that pigskin downfield. Goodwin blew past his man and snagged the ball right around the 50-yard line. As he took it to the house for an 83-yard score, the whole atmosphere shifted into something spiritual. Right before he crossed the stripe, he blew a kiss up to the heavens. Then he hit his knees right there on the turf to pray. His teammates swarmed him instantly, and there wasn't a dry eye in the bunch. Kendrick Bourne said he knew in his gut what that moment meant as soon as the ball was in the air, and sure enough, the Niners took home the victory. Goodwin didn't stick around. He rushed back to his wife's side and later shared their heartbreak with the world online. Then you got the story of Torrey Smith. That man made his name on being tough as nails and fast as lightning when it mattered most. But the blow that hurt him the worst didn't happen between the hash marks. It was September 23rd, 2012, a day that rattled the whole team to its core. Smith was more than just a hotshot receiver for Baltimore. He was the rock for his family, practically raising his younger kin like a daddy would. That's exactly why the news he got was a burden too heavy to bear. Before the big Sunday night showdown with the Patriots, his phone rang in the wee hours, changing his world forever. It was his baby brother, Tevin Jones, only 19 gone in a motorcycle wreck back in Virginia. Smith checked out of the hotel around 2 in the morning, with team security riding shotgun to go hold his family together. Folks reckoned he was out for the count, but later that morning, he looked Coach Harbaugh in the eye and said he wanted to play ball. Harbaugh told him straight up, "Son, the choice is 100% yours." Smith reckoned the only way to keep his head above water was to get out on that gridiron. When the boys in the locker room got wind of the tragedy, the grief hit him like a freight train, and truth be told, most didn't know which way was up. Ray Rice came out later, saying he couldn't even fathom lacing up his cleats with a heart that heavy. Even Ray Lewis said there was a hush over Smith that day, a quiet storm that made you want to tip your hat and keep your mouth shut. Come game time, Smith didn't just show up. He put on a show that'd make a grown man weep, playing like his very soul was on the line. He hauled in 6 balls for 127 yards and found the end zone twice, sealing a nail-biter against the Patriots, 31-30. You could tell every time he snagged that ball, it carried more weight than a sack of wet cement. There wasn't no hootin' and hollerin' after the plays, neither just a man holding his pain together with pure grit. Over on the sidelines, his brothers in arms were watching through misty eyes, struggling to keep it together. Once that clock hit 0, the dam finally burst wide open. Smith kept his words soft and low, later sending out a message about how much he loved his kin and the hollow feeling left behind when the lights went out. Now, folks, round the league knew Brett Favre was tougher than a $2 steak, the true Iron Man. The man was rawhide tough, scared of nothing, and had a spirit you couldn't break with a sledgehammer. But let me tell you, the darkest hour of his career wasn't about dropped balls, shiny rings, or record books. It happened on December 22nd, 2003, turning a regular old Monday Night Football scuffle into something so heart-wrenching nobody'd ever forget it. See, Favre was more than just the signal caller for Green Bay. He was the face on the poster, the ticker in that team's chest, and the definition of getting back up when you've been knocked down. This game was in his blood, mostly because it was the bond he shared deep down with his daddy, Irvin Favre. And Irvin, he wasn't just the man who raised him. He was the first fella to teach him to throw, the one who chewed him out the hardest, and the one cheering the loudest. They were stitched together by pigskin, hard work, and a whole lot of grit. Barely 24 hours before the Packers were set to tangle with the Oakland Raiders, the sky fell down. Word came down that Favre's daddy had a heart attack out of the blue and went on to glory. That news hit Brett harder than a linebacker blindside. It just tore him apart. Everybody in the locker room reckoned there was no way in hell he'd suit up. So he hightailed it home to be with his kinfolk, living on no sleep and barely touching a bite of food. But after a heart-to-heart with his mama, he made a call that left everybody jaw-dropped. He knew deep in his bones his daddy would have wanted him out there under those lights. So he headed back to Green Bay and told Coach Sherman, "Put me in, Coach, I'm playing." From the very first snap, you could feel magic in the air, something downright biblical was unfolding. Favre was playing with his heart on his sleeve, turning all that sorrow into laser-sharp focus. Every throw he made was hitting the bullseye, sweet as pecan pie. By the time they broke for halftime, he'd already chucked that ball for 311 yards and 4 scores. When the dust finally settled, Favre had racked up 399 yards and 4 touchdowns, whipping them 41-7. But it wasn't the numbers on the scoreboard that had grown men ballin'. All night long, the cameras caught Brett on the bench, fighting like hell to keep the waterworks back. Even them Raiders defenders said later they were just standing there in sheer wonder. Those Oakland fans, who usually act meaner than a rattlesnake, stood up and cheered for the man out of pure respect. After the whistle blew, Favre finally cracked during the interview, choking up while calling his daddy the finest coach he ever knew. His teammates were standing right there with him, tears streaming down their faces without shame. Now, let's talk about Sean Taylor. Folks in the league knew Sean was a terror on the turf, putting the fear of God in ya. But the saddest thing attached to his name wasn't about big hits or accolades. It happened back in December of 2007, and it left the whole squad weeping like a willow tree. Taylor wasn't just some run-of-the-mill safety guard in the backfield. Picked up 5th overall by the Redskins in 2004, he was the fire in the belly of that defense before you could blink. The boys in the locker room dubbed him Meast, a mix of man and beast on account of him hitting folks like a runaway freight train. That boy was all heart, fierce as a rattlesnake, but loyal as a hound dog to his kin. Come 2006, he'd snagged himself a Pro Bowl nod and was riding high in the saddle of his career. The Washington brass reckoned he'd be the backbone of their defense for a decade, but the good Lord had other plans, and they were mighty cruel. It was the night of November 26, 2007, down in Miami. Taylor was holed up with his gal and baby girl when some no-good thugs kicked in the door. He stood his ground to protect his own and took a bullet in the leg for his trouble. That slug cut right through his femoral artery, spilling lifeblood fast. Doctors tried their darndest to save him, but he passed on the very next day, scarcely 24 years of age. Word of it hit the NFL like a tornado touching down in a trailer park. Tough guys all over the league were knocked flat by the news. Folks just couldn't wrap their heads around it actually happening. Not even a week later, 6 days to be exact, the Redskins had to strap on their helmets to play the Buffalo Bills, heavy hearts and all. Something heavy hung in the air over FedEx Field that afternoon. They played a moving picture show honoring him before kickoff, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Then happened the thing that just about tore everybody apart. First play of the game, Washington trotted out with only 10 men on the grass. They left Sean Taylor's spot wide open, a ghost in the secondary, as the ball got snapped. Buffalo ran a simple play and gained some ground, but nobody gave a hoot about the yards. All eyes were fixed on that empty patch of dirt where their brother ought to have been standing. Fred Smoot said later it weighed on him like a sack of bricks, feeling like they'd failed to keep their kin safe. Grown men on both sides of the ball were all tore up inside. A few of them cast their eyes up to the heavens. Others were swiping away tears between downs. It wasn't just a ball game no more, I tell you what. It was a funeral procession in pads and helmets. Now, Chuck Hughes wasn't exactly a household name, but his darkest hour became a ghost story the league never forgot. Back on October 24th, 1971, he became the only soul to ever breathe his last breath right there on an NFL gridiron. The real tragedy was how quiet and sudden it was, happening right in front of folks who didn't know they were watching a man fade away. Hughes played receiver for the Detroit Lions, mostly a special teams grinder and a backup plug in holes. Back in college at Texas Western, he was a superstar, setting records that are still standing tall today. But by 1971, he was known more for grit and gumption than for making headlines. That whole season, poor fella had been fighting off sickness nobody could figure out. He'd already dropped like a stone in the locker room back in August and ended up in the hospital. The Sawbones thought it might be his spleen, but they missed the mark completely on what was really ailing him. He kept complaining of chest pains and feeling worn out, reckoning it was just bad heartburn. Even though he felt terrible, he laced him up and played on. Late in the fourth, with Detroit trailing 28-23 against the Bears, they were trying to mount a comeback. Hughes got the nod to go in when another fella got hurt. With barely a minute on the clock, he hauled in a 32-yard toss from Greg Landry, moving the chains deep into Bears land. Looked like just another catch, nothing fancy about it. 3 snaps later, trotting back to the huddle near the 20, the lights just went out. Every man on that field turned to stone. Hughes hit the grass shaking and grabbing at his chest. Dick Butkus, that mean old linebacker for the Bears, saw it happen and started waving like mad for the doctors, knowing it was bad news. An ambulance finally hauled him off to Henry Ford Hospital, but the clock ran out on him at 5:34 p.m. Poor Chuck wasn't but 28 years old when the good Lord called him home. His ticker just gave out on him a massive attack brought on by arteries hard as rock, and nobody had a clue it was coming. When the news hit the locker room, big, tough men crumbled like dry leaves. Every single one of them 40 Lions showed up to pay their final respects, left a young widow and a little boy, barely 2 years old, wondering where his daddy went. Then there's the story of Damar Hamlin. Young Buck was just getting his feet wet in the league when he found himself at the center of the most heart-wrenching scene football folks have ever witnessed. It all went down on a cold Monday night, January 2nd, 2023, with the Bills and Bengals going at it. Started off as just another game under the lights, but in a blink, it turned into a living nightmare that had players on both sides down on their knees, begging God for a miracle. About halfway through the first quarter, Burrow tossed a quick little pass to Higgins right around the 50-yard line. Higgins turned upfield looking for yardage, and Hamlin stepped up to stop him in his tracks. Looked like any other tackle you'd see on a Sunday. Hamlin took the hit, stood up tall for a heartbeat, and then fell straight back like a tree cut at the roots. Folks in the stands didn't rightly know what they were looking at initially. Quick as lightning, the medical crews from Buffalo came sprinting onto the grass. Hamlin was laying there still as a stone. They started pumping his chest right then and there, dragging out the defibrillator before the crowd could catch its breath. For nearly 10 agonizing minutes, those medics worked on him while his brothers stood there frozen, watching a man fight for his life. Old pros from both sidelines instinctively linked up, building a wall of humanity to give the man some dignity. Some of those giants hit the dirt in prayer, while others just wept openly. Josh Allen was on the sideline, hands covering his face, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Tre'Davious White was sobbing uncontrollably, saying later he felt completely useless watching his brother lay there. The Bengals boys were just as rattled, looking like they'd seen a ghost. They called the game right then and there, shut it down completely, which tells you just how heavy the air was that night. They rushed Hamlin over to the trauma center in Cincinnati, hanging on by a thread. Turns out it was a freak accident called commotio cordis, a hit to the chest at the exact wrong split second that throws the heart's rhythm into chaos. If you don't get that heart pumping again instantly, it's a death sentence, plain and simple. In the dark hours that followed, the whole football family circled the wagons. Didn't matter who you rooted for, everyone was sending up prayers. That toy drive Hamlin set up, it skyrocketed from a humble goal of $2,500 to millions practically overnight. Every donation came with a message of hope, fear, and love. By the grace of God, Hamlin pulled through and strapped his helmet on again. But nobody's forgetting that night anytime soon. Now, let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins. Folks know Hopkins for having hands like glue and making catches that defy the laws of physics. But the heaviest chapter of his story ain't about yardage or highlight reels. It's about his mama and a ritual that would bring a tear to a glass eye. Tragedy came knocking on Hopkins's door long before he ever signed an NFL contract. Lost his daddy to a car wreck when he was just a 5-month-old baby, leaving his mama, Sabrina, to raise 4 kids all on her lonesome. She was his rock, his fire, and the reason he kept pushing when things got tough. But when the boy was just 10 years old, his whole world got shattered a second time. Back in 2002, a woman with a grudge against Sabrina's boyfriend decided to take it out on her. She threw a boiling, devilish mix of bleach and lye right in Sabrina's face and down her back. Burned her so bad her skin came off, and it stole her sight forever. From that day forward, stepping onto the gridiron meant something different for DeAndre. Since his mama couldn't see him play no more, he came up with a special way to include her. Every single time he found the end zone, he'd march that ball over to the sideline and place it gently in her hands so she could feel the glory she couldn't see. That was just his special way of keeping her spirit right there by his side. And y'all, that deep history is exactly why one specific moment back in November of 2020 hit with the force of a freight train. Hopkins was suiting up for the Arizona Cardinals against them, Buffalo Bills, standing tall in the end zone while the clock was bleeding out and his boys were behind. Little Kyler Murray just heaved a prayer to the high heavens, flinging a desperate Hail Mary straight into a swarm of hungry defenders. 3 big old Bills players jumped up to swat it down, but Hopkins, he climbed the ladder higher than all of them. Don't ask me how, but with just one solitary hand, he plucked that pigskin out of the sky and landed square in the back of the paint. The whole stadium went absolutely bonkers, loud enough to wake the dead. But if you looked over at the sideline, there was a whole different story unfolding. Deshaun Watson, his old trail partner and quarterback, was caught on camera with tears streaming down his face. Now, he wasn't bawling just 'cause it was a spectacular grab. He was crying because he felt the weight of what that moment truly meant in his bones. He knew the hard road Hopkins had traveled. J.J. Watt. Now, folks, round the league knew J.J. Watt as a one-man wrecking crew, the toughest defender of his generation. But the moment that tugged at the heartstrings hardest wasn't about sacking quarterbacks, winning awards, or breaking records. It happened in January of 2023. His last rodeo, 11 grown men, players, coaches, and fans alike, blubbering like babies. Watt wasn't just some talented defensive end collecting a paycheck. He was the heart and soul of the franchise, a 3-time king of defense whose grit defined him just as much as his God-given talent. That final Sunday with the Arizona Cardinals turned into the emotional last page of the legend he'd written. See, Watt had just hung up his spurs, telling the world he was retiring a few days prior. And the timing of it all just made the air feel that much thicker. Just weeks before, him and his sweet wife Kealia had been blessed with their first little buckaroo, a son named Koa. Football wasn't the only son his world revolved around anymore. The boys in the locker room knew this was the end of the line, and Watt himself reckoned later he wasn't ready for that wave of emotion to crash down on him. Before trotting out to face the San Francisco 49ers, the Cardinals blindsided him with a touching tribute video filmed by those HBO Hard Knocks folks. When the screen went dark, Watt just sat there, quiet as a church mouse fighting a losing battle against the tears welling up. He'd go on to say that was one of the finest gifts anyone ever gave him. And let me tell you, the game itself just cranked the feelings up to 11. Watt didn't take it easy, not for a second. He played like his life depended on it, racking up 2 sacks and pushing that pocket all day long. Late in the 4th quarter, the coach pulled him out one last time. As he walked off toward the bench, something mighty surprising took place. Even them 49ers fans in the stands rose to their feet and started clapping, giving him a proper stand-in ovation, loud and proud. Watt dipped his head, his face all scrunched up, trying to hold it together. Even the enemies respected the man. Al Davis. Now, Al Davis was a titan, one of the biggest dogs the NFL ever saw. But the saddest chapter in his book wasn't about rings, fussin', or the Raiders running the show. It hit on October 9th, 2011, leaving the whole franchise, players, coaches, everybody bawling their eyes out. Davis wasn't just the boss man. He'd been riding with the Oakland Raiders for 39 long years. He had his hands in everything, working as a scout, head coach, GM, commissioner, and finally the big cheese owner. His famous saying, "Just win, baby," wasn't just some catchy sticker on a bumper. It was the code he lived and breathed by. The day before kickoff, old Al Davis passed on to glory at 82 years old, right there in Oakland, after his health had been fading for a while. His passing shook the Raiders organization like an earthquake. The players said that locker room was quiet as a tomb and heavy with grief. Those coaches were having a devil of a time keeping their heads in the game. See, to a lot of them, Davis was way more than just the man signing the checks. He was a guide, a guardian angel, and for plenty of folks, a second daddy. Old John Madden put it best when he said, "There ain't no replacing a fella like that. No, sir, not in a million years." But even with hearts heavy as lead, the Raiders still had a ball game to play. Barely 24 hours after saying their goodbyes, they were strapping on pads to face the Houston Texans. Every single helmet was sporting a black sticker that simply read, Al. You could cut the tension in that stadium with a knife. Feelings were running hotter than a pistol. Oakland was holding onto a lead late in the fourth, but those Texans were charging down the field like a stampede. On the very last snap, with the whole game on the line, Raiders safety Michael Huff snatched Matt Schaub's pass right out of the air in the end zone to seal the deal. Now what really curls your toes is the fact that the Raiders were playing with only 10 men on the field. The second that interception happened, the dam broke and emotions just spilled out everywhere. Grown men hit their knees in the grass. Coaches were weeping openly, not caring who saw. Head coach Hugh Jackson was all tore up, shaking his head and saying over and over, "Only Al Davis." He swore up and down that old Al reached down and had his hand on that ball himself. Folks started calling it the divine interception, reckoning Davis was that missing 11th man, standing guard in spirit. Now, let's talk about Eric Berry. That boy was known far and wide as one of the meanest, toughest safeties to ever lace up cleats. But the moment that tugged at the heartstrings the hardest didn't have a lick to do with tackling or trophies. It came after a fight way scarier than any gridiron match, leaving the whole stadium reaching for tissues. When KC grabbed him 5th in the 2010 draft, he didn't waste no time becoming the beating heart of that defense. But come December 2014, that whole life was nearly snatched away from him. Right after a scrap with the Raiders, the docs found a mass sitting in his chest. A few days later, they gave him the bad news, Hodgkin's lymphoma. Just like that, his season came to a screeching halt. Then came the chemo, and Lord knows that ain't no picnic. Eric said there were long, dark nights where the tears wouldn't stop flowing, and he had to lean hard on his mama, Carol, just to make it through. By the time May rolled around in 2015, he'd finished his treatments. 4 weeks later, the doctors gave him the all-clear cancer-free, praise be. When he got back to the Chiefs that summer, just being near the pigskin again was almost too much for him to handle. Flying out to Phoenix for a preseason tilt, he broke down, sobbing, realizing he was really gonna smell that grass and hear the roar of the crowd again. When his boots finally touched the turf, you could feel the emotion in the air, thick as humidity. Before kickoff, he grabbed his mama on the sideline and held her tight, tears streaming down both their faces. And Eric didn't just show up. He came back swinging like a heavyweight champ. In that 2015 season, he played lights out, grabbing Pro Bowl nods and taking home the Comeback Player of the Year award. But the real tearjerker happened down in his hometown of Atlanta in December 2016. Late in the fourth, Berry picked off a pass and ran it all the way back to the house to ice the game. Soon as he crossed that line, he marched right over and handed that game ball to his mama in the stands. Y'all let us know what you reckon in the comments down yonder. And before you scoot, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to NFL Facts so you don't miss out on the next big story.